and welcome to our panel discussion, Impact of Cryptocurrencies on Earth, just how green cryptocurrencies are and if tokenomics play a role in incentivizing the adoption of regenerative agriculture and also of renewable energy. My name is Greg Raffam. I'm the director of the Hub here. It's an innovation center and entrepreneurship incubator at University of Toronto Scarborough. And we have our panelists, and to welcome our panelists today, we have Mike Grantis, founding partner of Contango Digital Assets. We have Wes Geisenberger, Vice President of Sustainability and Environmental, Social, and Governance, that's ESG, at the HBAR Foundation, and Christina Mileva, co-founder and Chief Operating Officer and Legal Counsel of DOVU. So before we get to our panelists, just a couple of brief housekeeping tidbits or tips. During today's panel discussion, we will be asking for questions from you. And we'd like you to place those in the Q&A. Please don't place them in the chat because they'll maybe get missed in with other chat comments. Please place them directly in the Q&A. This is something the panelists and I see and will turn to twice during the session. So once at about 1:45 and another time closer to the end of the panel session. Also, at the end of the webinar, we'll post a link to a brief feedback survey. If you'd kindly take a moment to provide that, your comments are crucial to our being able to provide and support events like the event that we have today, which is made possible by the University of Toronto Scarborough, Centennial College, and a generous grant in terms of our being able to provide this kind of event to you. So greetings from the Hub, also from the Office of the VP Research and Innovation and the EaRTH District in terms of that. And also, of course, from the Hub in terms of it being a place that we bring in and bring innovation and startups from an idea to their actual creation of something that they want to bring into being. We'll see an example of that in a moment or two down the road. But yeah, from the OVPRI, Kate, in terms of things, a comment, asked to unmute.
Yes, hi, Greg. Well, thank you very much for agreeing to host us today. And thank you very much, our panelists, for being here, Wes and Mike and Christina. Looking really forward to our conversation. I will not bring greetings formally from the OVPRI, but Gray is here to represent the OVPRI and the Hub, and we look forward to him representing your district and helping us with this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. At this point, in terms of greetings from the Environmental and Related Technologies Hub, also known as the EaRTH District, consortium of 5 academic institutions that span the Eastern GTA, all right, including Scarborough, Durham Region, Peterborough, namely Centennial College, University of Toronto Scarborough, Ontario Tech University, Durham College, and Trent University. EaRTH District will strengthen and enhance the region's clean technology, and through research, academic programming, and commercialization of advanced technology, bring new opportunities to bear. We'd like now to take a moment to introduce our panelists, have them introduce themselves, and the foundation or firm that they represent today. So let's start with Krasina of Dover. So Krasina, just bring you up onto stage here. And yes, please introduce yourself. Thanks.
Thank you, Gray. Hello, everyone. Morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much for having me. As already mentioned, I am one of the founders of DOVU. I'm based in the UK. I'm a seasoned tech lawyer with vast experience in the startup scale-up world, but also I have my experience in a few big corporations as well. I'm passionate about blockchain technologies, crypto and Web3. And I'm also a very proud granddaughter to my grandparents who used to farm their lands in Bulgaria for many years. And I used to help them when I was younger. DOVU is a carbon offset protocol. We have built a marketplace that allows for individuals and entities to purchase verified carbon credits, which credits have been sourced by farmers globally. And with those funds, from the purchases, the whole ecosystem incentivizes the farmers to implement sustainable practices, which in turn allows for them to create more carbon credits. Right?
Nice. Thank you very much, Krasina. Now let's turn to Mike from Contango Digital Assets. Mike, just going to bring you up in terms of things here. So,
thanks, Gray. And then also, thanks to everybody for putting this together, and thanks for the invite. I'm really excited for the conversation. Personal background, I got into crypto in 2016. Started pretty much just as a trader of liquid tokens. Later on, got into investing in private allocations. Cut my teeth working for a digital asset brokerage in Canada called SatStreet, helping institutions, get access to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. Later on, left that to start a crypto media company called Crypto Weekly, which is still up and running today, but more on the passive side from my side. And today, run Contango Digital Assets with a co-founder and a team of 11 people. Contango is focused on Web3 investments, looking to invest in infrastructure and kind of great founders that are building the internet of the future. And so we're looking for the applications and for the protocols that are going to bring the next million or billion people into crypto. And given the sharp growth trajectory of our industry, I think the conversation that we're having today around carbon offsets and around the green energy surrounding cryptocurrencies is imperative. So really excited for the conversation. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to getting started.
Thank you, Mike. It's wonderful to have a Toronto-based VC interested in early-stage crypto projects here. And also turning to Wes from the HBAR Foundation, formerly helping lead business development for the Hedera hash graph. So just a second for me bringing you up onto stage here as well. And there you go, Wes.
Thanks again, Gray, and I appreciate everyone being here, and thank you all for having me. As Gray said, I'm Wes Geisenberger. I'm the VP of Sustainability and ESG for the HBAR Foundation. And what the HBAR Foundation is an ecosystem development fund focused on a few key areas for the benefit of the Hedera network. And one of those key areas is sustainability. And we have this fund called the Sustainable Impact Fund, which I help lead, where we're investing over $100 million this year into projects all throughout the Web3 ecosystem, focusing on environmental outcomes. And what we're trying to do is not just create things like carbon offsets with this funding, but invest in projects like DOVU, who are creating outcomes, not just in the environmental space, but also in the social space, providing equity for folks like farmers to be able to have access to liquidity, things of that nature. And on the flip side, we're also looking at things like measuring emissions, or in related spaces, facilitating trading of things like water, tokenized assets that can be more auditable, and we're investing in open source infrastructure to do so. We're really excited about this space. We see it as naturally an area that's benefited by emerging technologies like DLTs or blockchains, where we can use them as a tool for better auditability, better transparency, and facilitate better monetization and equitable outcomes for the participants involved.
Nice, thank you very much. So now that we've introduced ourselves, let's move on to, and Mike, I think this first question is going to be with you. So let's bring you up onto stage as well. Oh, sorry. I'm being reminded. I omitted to have a land statement here as part of what we were saying. So before we go further, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Thank you. And thanks for the reminder on that. So just to, okay, here we go, we're back. So we're just gonna add Mike up onto the, with us here. So as we turn to part one of our panel, addressing the stigma about public DLT blockchain carbon footprints. DLT, for those that don't know, stands for Digital Ledger Technology. So Mike, are some blockchain networks less carbon or energy intensive than others? And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so definitely there is a difference between blockchain networks and kind of the energy consumption that they produce. I would say, there's two major categories of consensus mechanism for blockchains. Those being proof of work, which is like Bitcoin and kind of Ethereum 1.0, and proof of stake, which a lot of the newer blockchains are kind of based on. And proof of stake is actually a lot less, uses a lot less energy than proof of work. And so I guess for the focus of this initial part of the conversation, we can talk about proof of work because it's really Bitcoin that gets the brunt of the heat around, sustainability and energy consumption. And so, with proof of work, really energy is the input that is needed to secure the blockchain. And so when we talk about the energy consumption of Bitcoin, I think it's also really important to notice, what that energy consumption is doing. And that's securing a monetary network that is truly global and decentralized and peer-to-peer. And, that's really a big accomplishment. And then we should look at parallels towards what is securing the monetary network that we have today. And the monetary network, the global standard today is dollars, right? And so what is securing the dollar in terms of, making it the hegemonic currency of the world? And that would be the military industrial complex. And so when we look at the energy consumption of Bitcoin versus the energy consumption of the military industrial complex, we can see that Bitcoin is actually, in some ways a lot better than the energy output of the military industrial complex. And actually some quotes have it at only 2% of the energy output. And so I think we can't have the conversation around sustainable energy or the energy inputs of a blockchain without first understanding, what those energy inputs are going towards and what problem are they helping to solve for. And I would argue that, Bitcoin is actually one of the most efficient monetary networks on Earth. And, the reason for that is the proof of work, consensus algorithm. And we can talk about, the types of energy consumption too, right? Like, is it fossil fuel energy or is it clean energy that's going into Bitcoin? And actually, given the transparency of the network, we can actually see, where that kind of energy mix is coming from. And most estimates, have Bitcoin's energy production at over 50% green. And so I think, Bitcoin is one of those technologies that's actually working to bring, the green energy movement forward because because it always looks for the lowest cost energy. And, we can talk about this a little bit more about kind of how miners look at their energy mix, but it's really doing a lot to really push forward green energy. And I think that's important to talk about as well.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Inputs and where they're going. Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Mike. Turning to Wes. Wes, do you have any thoughts or comments on the research underway and the varying degrees of energy consumption, well known in terms of blockchain networks, in terms of building on what we're discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was a really good point to just differentiate between proof of work and proof of stake, just because they're very, very different consensus mechanisms. And fundamentally, we have to think about distributed ledgers as agreeing on the state of a series of balances and putting transactions in order, because that's what consensus mechanisms do, whether they're proof of work or proof of stake. And they each have different features or benefits. At Hedera, we really think about the trilemma that blockchains or DLTs have in terms of achieving high scalability, so strong performance in the terms of tens of thousands of transactions a second, with what we call asynchronous Byzantine fault tolerant security, the highest form of security in distributed ledgers, while also maintaining stability of the network so we don't have to have concerns about forks or concerns about any type of divergence of agreement of when those transactions are in order or the balances in various accounts. Now, what that leads to in practice is a large difference of energy consumption, because in proof of work, a lot of miners are trying to solve puzzles to achieve an agreement on what transaction goes in what order. And in Hedera and other proof of stake networks, there's a variety of ways, but in Hedera's way, it's gossip about gossip with virtual voting. It's a consensus mechanism, which achieves that degree of security to have transactions be final, put them in the right order, and achieve that balance. And what that leads to from an energy consumption perspective, since computers are not trying to solve complex math puzzles and have tens of thousands of computers incented to do so, is it's a very low kilowatt hour consumption. And we see this in a lot of proof of stake networks, but Hedera actually, per a study by UCL or University College of London, came out as the lowest when it was compared against Polkadot, Tezos, Algorand, Cardano, even the Visa network as a kind of a constant, if you will. And it came out that on a per kilowatt hour basis per transaction, it was 0.00002 kilowatt hours compared to the Visa network being 0.00358, or Bitcoin being 357 kilowatt hours per transaction on the lower bound and over 3,600 on the upper bound, depending on what type of transaction and what time of day. And so we have these wide differences of each of these networks, but it comes down to how we agree to put transactions in order, which is what leads to these divergence of consensus mechanisms and energy consumption. I think when we think about that from a tool set perspective of what applications we're trying to build and what use case we're trying to achieve, there's very different requirements. So, Bitcoin oftentimes is thought of as digital gold. Well, maybe it's good to have a lot of computers, but we have to consider the environmental cost and kind of our own consciousness of, well, if we're going to hold this asset, what environmental impact we have, and are we operating intentionally? With Hedera, where we're operating in large utility use cases, where there's going to be lots and lots of transactions, it's very good to have this low carbon footprint, this low energy consumption, so that we can achieve really complex applications that are oftentimes decentralized, where we need the trust of a public ledger as a tool, where we need to be able to operate at scale with high security to get to complex outcomes, a really utility focused layer one. And I think that's really important to think about as we're looking at these studies. And UCL did a fantastic job laying out all these different networks and how they get to consensus and what the network looks like in order to be able to achieve that.
Thank you very much, Wes, and very clear as well in terms of steps. Thank you on that. Turning to Krasina. And just a second. Here, there we go. So, Krasina, why is it important, do you think, for blockchain projects to be proactively minimizing their carbon footprint? Additionally, why should large and small carbon emitters be thinking about high-quality carbon offsets?
But before I even get to that, I think it is important to remind ourselves that the net zero initiative applies to all of us globally, individually and on a corporate level as well, no matter what industry we're operating in. So it is important for all of us to be minimizing our carbon footprint and, where possible, offset the emissions which are unavoidable. As Mike and Wes already mentioned, within our space, there are a lot of staggering numbers out there talking about the crazy consumption of energy, comparisons of Bitcoin consuming up to the whole carbon footprint of New Zealand, the 37 megatons of CO2, then talking about Ethereum and the consumption over there, where there was a comparison. Of course, that was prior their move to proof of stake, where there was a study which discovered that one Ethereum transaction actually equals to the average of electricity consumption of 8 days for a US household. And on top of that, we know that within the NFT space, which is booming nowadays, most of the digital assets created there are created on the Ethereum network, although we're seeing more and more created on less power consuming protocols. So having said all of that and knowing all of that information, I do think that it is important, just full stop. The first step for all companies within our sector specifically, I think would be to opt in for greener protocols. And it always goes back to the lawyer in my head, because I love privacy. And for me, privacy by design is a thing that needs to be implemented in every single technology use. So I apply the same logic to why don't we apply the net zero initiative by design principle when we're building any product protocol within the blockchain space? Because if we do, I definitely think that would definitely improve the consumption, but also the carbon emissions of our space. And to the latter point, to the second question, I think before we even again get to the whys, I think we need to agree on to what do we mean by high quality carbon offsets, because in the short space of time for the past few years that I've interacted with various stakeholders within the space, and by the space I mean the blockchain space, but also the sustainability space, I've seen so many different definitions as to what high quality carbon is. We at DOVU see it as, and it's usually, to be fair, referred to that level of confidence one can have that the use of that credit will fulfill the basic principle, and that quality has two main components. The first and foremost, a quality offset credit must represent at least 1 metric ton of additional permanent and unclaimed CO2 emission reduction. And secondly, the quality offset credit should come from activities that have not significantly contributed to social or environmental harms. So to qualify as a genuine carbon offset, we would, and to think about a high quality offset, we would always look into something called additionality. And we look into the additionality within our marketplace and the carbon offsets being available there, and to ensure that the additionality is in place. I think on that basis, and again, thinking with the net zero initiative by design, it's almost a no-brainer, and in it's self-explanatory as to why carbon emitters should be looking into the high-quality carbon credits, which inevitably have a better impact on our planet.
And thanks very much, Krasina. And particularly on the last note, yeah, that's you're giving us a lot to think about on this. Turning to Mike on a question here. Do investors care, you think, about the footprint and about environmental social governance in terms of a philosophy for blockchain networks? Also, second part to that, do you think it varies in terms of where in the world you're from, what country, in terms of how those investors might be involved, and where do you think Canada kind of fits with this when it comes to institutional and retail investors?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, so the short answer is it depends, right? It depends on your investment thesis. It depends on your mandate as a fund or whatnot. I would say definitely it is. It's something that's on the forefront of our minds as investors. And I think, broadly speaking, North American investors tend to be some might say more environmentally conscious than some, Asian regions. But I would also say it very much depends on the investor themselves, what their mandate is, right? So it is definitely something that, needs to be part of your due diligence process. Once these technologies get to scale, we're going to have big problems on our hands if there's no types of carbon neutrality, or at least plan in place for those carbon offsets. And so I think what companies like what DOVU are doing is really important. And I also think it's amazing that the industry that we're in makes this so possible, right? Having the ability to transfer these credits across borders and at the speed of the internet is incredibly impactful. And it also just births an entire new industry and use case for these carbon credits. So I totally commend what DOVU is doing and kind of the mission that you guys are taking on. It is definitely something that needs to be at the forefront of investors' mindset. Now, that could also differ between institutional investors and retail investors, right? If you're a publicly traded company, or if you have large LPs that have environmental or ESG mandates, that will affect your investment decisions as well. So there are a lot of factors that go into it, but as an investor myself, I think it's definitely a conversation that needs to be at the forefront of your due diligence process.
And Canadian investors, where do we stack, you think?
So to be fair, I don't have any. Maybe I would defer to one of the other panelists for this. I don't have specific data. I can only speak from my own experience, but I think for the most part, Canadian investors are environmentally conscious. But maybe I'll defer to another panelist to answer that question.
Fair enough. Fair enough, Mike. Bringing Wes onto stage here. Wes, you've recently been on the road with a strategic innovation fund. Any trends that you're noticing in terms of consumer and investor, appetite for high quality carbon credits, blockchain tech, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. And one thing I'd love to highlight, and this is an old quote, but I think it's a good quote, is Microsoft pointed out a while back, it was almost a year ago at this point, that there was not enough verified supply of high quality offsets or removals, what they call verified supply, for their own purposes as a company. That trend is still there, and I would say it's growing. Companies are now more and more realizing that they need to better understand these types of assets. They need to think about environmental accounting or ESG accounting more like they think about their own finances for publicly reported companies. In the States, the SEC has actually come out with guidelines or ask a request for comments around guidelines for emissions reporting, and that's becoming a big topic globally because it's for any publicly traded company. And so we've seen this have ripple effects around the globe. And so when we're going on the road, as you said, we're seeing folks reacting to that in a very interesting manner. Before, even looking 2-3 years ago, folks were saying, we do care about our ESG goals. We want to show what we're doing, but there wasn't the stringency and the interest in the granular information behind that, both for offsets as well as emissions accounting. And so what we're seeing folks invest in, actually from a corporate perspective, is they're investing in systems that look at the veracity of information, even in their own supply chains, to actually account for emissions. They want to know it for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, exactly where they're coming from, what countries they're happening in, exactly how they're happening, so that they can better understand their footprint, and not just from an environmental perspective, but also from a social and equitable perspective for how they're interacting with their supply chains. On the flip side of that, once they have that information, they're also saying, well, how do I offset that with credible offsets? How do I engage with someone like DOVU? How do I understand the audit trails behind some of the assets they're creating? And can I verify them? Can I prove to someone, when I say transparently I'm selling a carbon neutral product, that this is happening, that I'm not just buying something with a sticker on it that is, a company's taking an estimate and saying, I think we did this right, I think we accounted for this, right? Because folks aren't necessarily always holding them accountable if you go back 2 or 3 years. And now what we're seeing is companies investing in that. And what we're actually seeing from the VC community and the impact community is they're investing in projects that are going in this direction of high veracity information, where they know the process or the methodology that's from these voluntary carbon markets or traditional compliance markets. They know the roles who fulfill responsibilities within that methodology, the actors who fulfill those roles, their identities, and the data that they produce. They want to see that level of information. And as part of that, they want to know it for emissions accounting and offsets so they can better rationalize their impact on the world when they're deploying capital to go get credits or in their own environmental footprint from their accounting internally.
Thanks, Wes. That was also an incredibly great segue in terms of Krasina and some of the, just saying, how can people get involved in DOVU? How can they have confidence in that? Do you have additional thoughts about, maybe from a European perspective, regions where you have active farmer participation and how this is being picked up, and if you want to build on what Wes was just talking about? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. It's actually really interesting to listen to Mike and Wes talking from completely different perspectives, and it ties up so greatly with what we're trying to achieve, and it's just so exciting. I think Europe is a bit of a different one, but at the same time is the same one, because that most of the legislation coming around the various ESG initiatives is being very stringent and followed by a lot of countries within the EU. So from pure corporate need of that green accounting that Wes was talking about, a lot of the businesses need that and they're imposed to have that. But then at the same time, on the investor side of things, from what we've seen so far, is that more and more investors are actually interested into the space and understanding the importance as to what is currently built and the foundations being created for the future to come. In terms of, I guess, our solution and how is that fitting in within that puzzle, Wes was talking about the level of detail that companies are interested in. And when we started to build our platform, we focused exactly on that. We wanted to ensure that when someone comes to our marketplace and decides to purchase a verified carbon, they would have all the necessary details in front of them to make that informed decision as to, do I want to contribute to this project? So we built something called an Audit Trail, where you would, as a buyer, are able to see every single step taken within the process of onboarding that carbon on the platform. But also you can go back in history and check that in a few years' time, should you wish to do that. Everything is happening, as Mike said, with the speed of the internet, because we do use Hedera Hashgraph, and it's just great. But also, I think the impact on the farmer side of things, it's just immense, because it's just an interesting when you have those conversations with the farmers and actually speaking with farmers in different jurisdictions. It is mind-blowing in terms of the different setups and how they perceive the whole voluntary carbon market. It's just, yeah, mind-blowing.
Thanks very much, Krasina. I'm going to bring a few folks now up. So we're going to add Wes, we're going to add Mike. I'm going to ask also for Bill Chow to join us. And I'll add Bill there as well. So we're turning to questions. And we'll begin with a question from Bill Chow of The Bridge. So Bill, can you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all. Thank you for sharing such valuable information. I have a question here. So besides of energy use, and of course, we're focusing on the carbon footprint, during the last Bitcoin rush, a lot of miners, particularly retail miners, have driven the demand for different computer components like GPUs and other semiconductors components. I can imagine the environmental damage that would be driven by this manufacture process of these devices. And worse, where are these going to end up in the landfill a few years down the road when they're outdated? So I wanted to know, how is the proof of stake going to be different versus the proof of work? And would that situation be improved going forward?
I may be able to hop in here, and I can speak specifically to Hedera and how Hedera views kind of responsible development from a network perspective. And I think one of the comparisons you can think about is, well, DLT is very similar to other emerging technologies. You can even think of something like a bike share system. If anyone remembers seeing the piles of bikes in China after they deployed bike shares into every city, and then in certain cities, the business models just didn't work in the tier 1 cities, and you have mountains of bikes. Well, you have the same situation with GPUs and mountains of computers that go out of date in 2 to 3 years. At Hedera, the governance of the network, the initial nodes were bootstrapped for up to 39 companies that are running actually commodity hardware, commodity servers that you would see in data centers traditionally. And so over time, it's going to be slow, responsible growth to a permission network that ultimately scales to permissionless. And this responsible growth allows the network to scale in a way that doesn't cause extreme damage by massive adoption or impact the security of the network. Because one of the primary reasons for security and scaling to massive amounts of nodes for Bitcoin is because you want to have that proof of work. You want to have lots of miners competing to help form the next block. In Hedera, with the proof of stake system, you're allowing folks to move balances or stake balances against specific nodes to calculate votes, which today are equal on the Hedera network. So from a governance perspective, it's often very much tied into security and making sure the networks are able to put transactions in order, as well as agree on the state or the balance. And in Hedera, the way the Hashgraph consensus algorithm works, that's very easy to do with this number of computers in an extremely secure way, with large-scale corporations from across geographies, across industries, managing the initial nodes, where we open to permission members of the community and ultimately permissionless proof of stake as the treasury goes to the rest of the economy over time. And so that's a really exciting way to do it, because we don't have this massive environmental footprint as represented by some of the numbers I shared earlier. But other networks think about it slightly differently. And what we're trying to do is avoid the situation where we have piles of bikes or the equivalent of 5 years down the road.
Thank you very much.
And we have a few questions from the audience to ask in terms of this. So one, is there any online website or resource which can give comparative energy and carbon footprint of various payment process systems on a real-time basis? So I guess the question here is, first, are there those resources? But the last bit being, I think, real-time basis. So they're looking at it being very up-to-date, very factual, very reliable. Thoughts? Mike, it seems like you want to say something.
To be fair, I was hoping I might have a recommendation, but unfortunately I don't have anything that comes to mind, that provides that real-time access.
I can jump on here. I'm not familiar with a whole encompassing tool which provides with that information, but what we have built is a very small version of that, which is the calculation of the emissions within the Ethereum network. So we have a tool called the carbon calculator, which if you plug in with your Ethereum wallet, it would automatically calculate and tell you based on your transactions how much carbon you need to offset based on the energy consumed for those transactions. So I guess a small step in the bigger picture is what we've taken on here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you much. There's well, Wes, did you have a thought on this question, or shall we move to the next?
I think we can move to the next. I think using the networks that are fully transparent and available are always a good way to see things. Ethereum is transparent, in terms of the transactions that they do, and DOVU does a fantastic job with carbon market cap to show that. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
So the next question, and then we'll return back to the SET program. It's a question of what are the advantages? What advantages does your model of tokenized cap and trade provide relative to centrally managed state systems? So yeah, thoughts on this? I mean, it's a big question, right? Unpacking that one could take a while. Anyone want to take a stab at starting that?
So I think maybe it's good to differentiate between the voluntary markets and the compliance markets for credits. So cap and trade, comes out of different international regulatory frameworks and proposals, and then ultimately the implementation of those at a national or local level, depending on certain states that have taken that approach. The voluntary markets are, oftentimes where we see a lot of activity, specifically in the blockchain or DLT ecosystem, where you want to be able to get credit for capturing or sequestering carbon or removing carbon. And many of the emerging technologies, such as direct air capture or soil-based sequestration, have seen rapid growth in these voluntary markets, because most of the times governments don't necessarily account for emissions being captured with emerging technology, not in the sense of blockchain or DLT, but actually sequestration-based technology built on physical processes. And so in the voluntary markets, oftentimes these methodologies of capturing, defining the roles and the methods for capture, improving the quantitative outcome of that, they're defined there and brought into compliance systems when it's actually proven, to a higher degree of veracity. But at the same time, cap and trade also allows for the permissions or trading of the credits, the ability to emit. And that's something that's a little different than what happens in the voluntary markets, which are mostly focused on the capture of greenhouse gas emissions and then using it to offset for, say, corporate emissions, especially in areas where it's not tightly regulated. So the United States, for example, doesn't have across the entire, at a country level, doesn't have an ability to say, hey, every company is only allowed to emit so much in their sector. And so what companies do is they voluntarily agree to neutrality goals. And they say, okay, I'm accounting for these emissions. I'm going to publicly disclose them, and then I'm going to offset them. The voluntary market is where they get the credits to offset them. So when I mentioned Microsoft earlier, saying there's not enough verified supply, companies like Microsoft are disclosing their emissions, the sources of energy, the sources of not just the energy consumption, the emissions tied to it, but the sources of the products that they produce or the transportation emissions that come with their products and any other type of emission. And they go and buy those offsets, oftentimes in the voluntary market, oftentimes from companies that are using emerging technologies like direct air capture, soil-based sequestration, biochar, and other scientific methodologies to account for carbon capture.
Nice. Thank you. Krasina, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to add something from a slightly different point of view when it comes to the advantages of using the specific technology and linking it back to the asset being available on the marketplace. So I do believe, and we do believe, that we are actually tackling a very well-known issue within the space, specifically around the double counting or the numerous counting of the same tree being planted or contributed for, and the inability for a lot of projects to actually track down, monitor, and ensure that these projects which are being made available out there are actually doing, for once, what they're saying they are, and then secondly, we're not buying the same tree 5 times, and then this actually same tree is still alive or hasn't been cut down, died, or whatever. So I think that the advantage of using technologies within not only the voluntary markets, but just generally the markets is pretty big when it comes to sorting out the double counting problem.
Thank you. Mike, thoughts?
I think just going back to Kristina's point about, using blockchain technology for this type of counting, right? One, you allow these transfer of credits, as we said, at the speed of the internet, and so you can have a much larger marketplace of potential buyers and sellers, as opposed to just local markets. Two, you can connect people, a lot quicker, potentially, peer-to-peer trades of carbon credits. And so just having the base layer technology being built on distributed ledger technology it really allows for a lot of innovation in the space of carbon capture and carbon credit trading.
Thank you. Yeah. At this point, I'm just going to remove the few spotlights and talk just a second about, before we move to the next part two, a bit about the hub and a bit about what's been going on here. Again, my name is Greg Graffam. I'm the director of the hub here at University of Toronto Scarborough. Over the past, 7 years, I've been blessed with the opportunity to work with environmental science here at the university, and with various students that have come from there with various things that they want to start for a particular initiative, something that might have come from their research, spun out, something that they want to do. I want to share a few of those with you. In terms of that, the easiest thing is to share one as a video that we've produced.
Hi, my name is Shamik Das. I'm a graduate from U of T. I studied Masters of Environmental Sciences here. My product is DOVU, which is a backpack company, and it has the ability to sanitize your items on the go at the touch of a button using UV technology.
And besides Shamik, we've had others at the hub. Luna Yu came here several years ago, having discovered how to convert organic waste to biodegradable plastic. We've also had folks wanting to be more involved in blockchain and in some of the technologies that we're talking about today. We've had an award-winning company come through called Transcripts, which is looking at how to leverage blockchain as a way to authenticate various of your transcripts and documents about your qualifications, your work experience, etc. So we're focused on how to take these ideas from students and from recent alumni and make them real. And I'm looking forward very much to how we can become more involved in the EaRTH related technologies that are going to be built from the initiatives here, and getting much more involved. And if somebody comes and has the idea of something like DOVU, I mean, oh my God, that would be just heaven above. So I'd be very, very blessed. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Returning back to now the program at pace here. So in terms of part two, the role of distributed ledger technology and how tokenomics is incentivizing sustainable environmental practices. So the first question, can renewable energy credits, RECs, or RECdefi, help fast track the adoption of renewable energy supply to the grid? So if we can bring Wes up onto stage here and ask this question of, can you help define first REC or RECdefi, provide an example and let us know what you think about renewable energy credits.
Yeah, absolutely. And so RECs are, first off, they're a tokenized unit of energy, so it's a megawatt hour. And what they are is they're not the actual energy itself, but it is a representation of that energy to show that it's renewable. And oftentimes they're sold to offset some other type of energy consumed on the grid. And so in most cases, this is done in the voluntary market around the world, where we want to be able to get credit for the type of green energy we're producing and offset some other type of energy that we're consuming. In some places, there are compliance markets that say, I'll pay, governments will say, I'll pay a certain amount for producing renewable energy to incent the growth of renewable energy adoption. So for example, in the United States. There's certain states like California, which pay over $200 a megawatt hour or a credit. And there's other districts like District of Columbia, I think at the last I looked was over $400 credit to incent the growth. And of course, then that's used to offset the formal grid operators who are in those jurisdictions. And those grid operators buy those credits to help grow their renewable energy footprint. What can be done from a blockchain or DLT perspective is looking at those credits and making them more auditable. So defining the process of how you can measure that megawatt hour, proving that it's actually happening, because oftentimes it's very difficult to understand, well, where is this renewable energy being produced? Where is it being consumed? How do we avoid a double counting issue? Because the grid is actually producing quite a bit of energy outside of the renewables. There's also loss of energy through the transmission process. And so we want to make sure that when we're accounting for all this renewable energy or the mix of energy, say that the grid has 20% renewables today, not all those renewables are very efficient if they go far because someone's consuming or transferring that. So they'll transfer the financial product and the REC to help balance that out, even though that actual energy being consumed may come from a coal-fired power plant. They're a good tool to help incent the growth of renewable energy, making it more expensive comparatively to produce dirty energy sources or produced from dirty energy sources. But what can be done, which I think is very interesting, is being able to trade those RECs on both local and international markets, and doing that via distributed ledger, very similar to carbon offsets or any other type of credit. And what can be done that I think is really interesting is if we treat those credits as uniques, as not fungible, so we can trace them back to the source, then of course we can start matching them. Maybe we match them every 15 minutes. And in certain countries, this is already being required by law, but RECs can actually be a good incentive mechanism to say, well, if you're producing the type of energy that's not incented locally from, say, coal-fired power plants or another dirty energy source, well, you have to go buy these credits every hour. And so maybe some of the credits are more expensive because they're being produced at peak hours, and maybe the credits that are being produced at off-peak hours, they could have different attributes. They could have different times of day that they were produced so that they match on a specific time period. They could have to match based on a specific energy source, say solar or wind or otherwise. And those are different things that we have to think about. And if we create the right incentive system to be able to trade these assets, in conjunction with the large power producers or consumers who say, I only want to buy renewable energy, I think that's where the opportunity lies. We have a lot of folks in our ecosystem doing that. So there's a project that we just announced a grant to called Timeless, who's actually implementing emission measurement systems as well as energy trading systems. So they have a project in the EU called TROPH, which is focused on just that. It's a consortium in partnership with Royal BAM. And that's something that they're really focused on, is figuring out better renewable energy trading as part of their project.
Thank you very much, Wes. Krasina, can you kind of expand on DOVU's carbon marketplace, how it works, and how it can form a novel revenue generation for farmers, and how that can be maybe rewarded for implementing regenerative agriculture and other farming practices? I mean, in terms of moving things forward, new agenda, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely, with the most pleasure. As I've mentioned earlier, talking to farmers globally has literally blown my head and my mind, because it is fascinating to see how different countries and different farmers take up on those initiatives in different ways. Generally, farmers don't live online, and the communication with farmers is slightly different than the communication that we're used to nowadays. And it's almost really easy to explain to them why the carbon credit is a great revenue generating source for them. If you break it down, for them, it's just an additional crop. If you treat the carbon credit as a crop, then it's fairly simple. If you follow certain rules and then you end up with X amount of credits, then you can sell those credits, and this is your additional stream of revenue. And I'm going to come on to that in a bit. Going back onto how the actual platform works, as I mentioned earlier, we have the Audit Trail. We have a very robust onboarding process where we partner with third parties which verify and do the carbon counting for the farmers. So we don't do it internally. We ensure that it is done by separate parties. Then we verify that these farmers are actually the owners of their lands as well. That's all been recorded within the audit trail. And once the carbon counting has been concluded, then we enter into the next stage where we have various conversations with those farmers around, great, yes, you have X amount of carbon credits and you'll be able to sell these on the marketplace, but also what are the next steps that you would take in order for you to either improve your farming practices, because some of these farmers need that, or can you keep up with the way that you've been farming your crops so far? Because surprisingly, there are quite a few farms out there which are already have implemented regenerative agriculture within their practices, have renewable energies in place. They use no-till methodologies when it comes to the farming, the crops and so on. So it's really fascinating to see the vast differences between the farmers globally. We do put those maintenance and management plans in place with the farmers to ensure that this is not a one-off sort of deal where they would sell their carbon credits in 1 year and that would be it, which in effect would be devastating for the market. But thinking about the end goal, actually improving the soil, sequestering the carbon, having a better impact on the planet, we need a longer term that needs to be monitored, and a longer term where those practices needs to be implemented. And in all honesty, when you break it down to the farmers, they totally get it. They absolutely love it as well. I think for me personally, the most heartwarming moment so far within our marketplace was when we've sold the credits for a very cute couple here in Bulgaria, and they had a very small piece of land. So the amount that they've received for their credits wasn't a massive amount. But when we've sent them the money and then I had a follow-up conversation with them, bless their hearts, they were crying and they were so happy that they've received the funds which would help them to take out all the old bushes and then replant with new bushes, which is actually something that they needed to do for their farm in order for them to improve their practices. So just to think of how those small little things make a massive difference, not only on a global level, but also on a personal level as well, has just been fascinating. And they're already excited for the next year. And they've been asking, what else can we do? How can we improve our practices? And it's not just about the money. It's actually about how can we do better, which would then end up to having better air and more carbon being sequestered in the soil, which is, I think, the most rewarding piece out of everything that we do. So yeah, it's not hard to actually persuade them to follow more sustainable practices.
Oh, that's a great story. Oh, wow. Just going to bring Wes up as well here. To kind of build out and expand on this topic just a bit. So addressing you both, are there other projects that we should also know about that are doing things on carbon sequestration?
Yeah, there's quite a few in the Hedera ecosystem. So a lot of them are building on this open source tool we have called The Guardian. I'll be completely transparent because it's a public ledger. We don't know everyone that's building. We see a lot of folks coming into the space that we didn't know existed yesterday. That happens every week. So on top of working with folks like Christina and the DOVU team, we're working with folks around the world. So I mentioned Timeless earlier, and they have a few different customers that they've talked publicly about, like Yuan, like Trove, like the government of Queensland, doing various things from managing emissions or accounting for emissions, as well as creating different types of credits. We also have different folks who are building open source infrastructure and then taking that and building on it around the world. And so we have folks, and I can't go into too much detail with names, but doing things like verified emission reductions in Africa. We have multiple projects like that, things like Cook Stove, where they're generating tens of thousands of credits, where folks are saying, well, if I can add an IoT sensor to a Cook Stove and I can pull data from that cook stove, and I can actually prove it's being used and deployed to, instead of burning, burning wood, which is heavily chemically induced, then we can use a methodology that's actually been vetted by some of these registries and prove that that's happening. We have other folks who are taking farming practices in Eastern Africa, and they're actually improving the farming practices by removing farm waste from the sides of fields and stopping methane leakage. And they're actually proving that on Ledger. Those are the different types of projects that we see. Just in the verified emission reduction space, we see REC-based projects, soil-based sequestration projects, and they're happening all around the world. This is something that we're super excited about. We actually have been talking to some folks in Canada as well, who are in the oil and gas space, and they say, well, we really don't want to see emissions happen at the same rate that they are. And we want to improve the granularity of the accounting. And we want to go offset with equally granular carbon offsets. We see the same thing in Texas in the oil industry, where they say, we want to also mitigate based on a baseline of emissions and reduce those emissions. So we see projects all over the board, but they're all focused on this granularity of accounting. And I think that that's important because it gives us the transparency to say, this is in fact a problem. We can quantify this problem. We can then equally quantify the amount of change that we're making in terms of offsets, emission reductions, carbon removals, in the case of things like direct air capture technologies. And we can prove the exact impact we have that's additional, that's durable for a certain period of time, to prove that there's no leakage. So for example, if we're buying an offset from this project, we want to make sure that that isn't causing other emissions elsewhere, because we're buying it from one project, but say it's a log anti-deforestation project. We want to make sure there's not deforestation next door. We're able to prove all of these attributes around the projects that we're working with. And those are the types of things that we're seeing today on Hedera.
Oh, thank you. Krasina, anything to add?
I can't. I mean, I guess there are a lot of projects as Wes mentioned out there, and there are a lot of projects as well which do similar things to what we're doing, which is actually great, because we do think that the more companies out there focus on the carbon emission credits and how we improve the processes and how we make a change and how we pave the way for that, the better. And in reality, we're all paving that way. We're all creating those new principles and new practices, which is the most exciting thing. And definitely there's a play for everyone in the space. So yeah, I'm just really excited and enjoying to see all the various companies appearing in the space and learning more as to how they're approaching this subject matter.
Thank you.
Can I add something to that, Gray?
Sure, absolutely.
I think that's a great topic you just brought up about kind of working in collaboration with other, what would have been competitors in maybe a Web 2 space, now becoming contributors in a Web 3 space. And I think one of the great things about kind of this distributed ledger technology is it works on network effects. So you're not necessarily in competition with other people that are building in the same industry as you. In a lot of ways, they actually, add a multiplier effect and help you grow your business alongside them. So this kind of ethos of Web3, the ethos of, your network is your net worth in some cases holds true. And I think the composability of digital currencies allows for a lot more interoperability between competitors and contributors, or whatever you might call them. So I think it's a perfect space for this kind of merge between climate science, climate tech, and distributed ledger technology, because it's inherently collaborative.
Nice, thank you. Mike, I have a question for you here as well, in terms of things. You've been watching funding deals on crypto weekly, and you've been performing due diligence with Contango. Are you seeing any trends in retail and crypto relative to investors favoring blockchain networks, or are there some that are greener and hyper-focused on natural ecosystems? What do you see?
What I would say is if we look at the demographics of crypto, I would say it skews younger, right? Like early adopters of cryptocurrency tend to be, younger Gen Z, millennial age group. And it tends to be that those investors are a lot more focused on climate science than, the older generation. And not to paint with too broad strokes here, but that tends to be the case. And so I think, it's extremely valuable, not only as a marketing tool, but also as kind of, an ethos for your company to be focused on not only renewables, but on, being carbon neutral. And I think, we're starting to see that trend pick up for sure with new chains kind of claiming, carbon neutrality. I think that's a very valuable piece, as I spoke to earlier, about that should be part of any investor's kind of due diligence process is understanding that piece. But definitely it's interesting to see the evolution of the industry and how kind of we go back to these same conversations around energy consumption and around kind of the ways that we're addressing that in the industry. And I think one great thing about technology is, it continues to grow and iterate on itself. And as a community, if we put our focus and our efforts on things that we collectively find valuable, we're going to find solutions to those things faster. And so these types of conversations are really important because, having the understanding of what we want to accomplish as an industry will help kind of guide us there. And so that's kind of what I would say. Maybe the other panelists have some more concrete examples, but that's kind of the that's the way I look at the situation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Maybe if I can add one thing.
I sense there was something there.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I think one thing it's long overdue, but I would definitely say there's a shift in trend is that, finally climate tech is sexy, right? I would say the next kind of 100 unicorns might be in climate tech, right? Or in sustainable energy, carbon sequestration, agroforestry, because, this is finally, a real pressing topic. And we don't have a lot of time, we need to address it as soon as possible. And I think people are finally starting to realize that. And, when these types of investments become sexy, lots of money starts to flow into the industries, and those industries can grow a lot faster. So I think maybe it's a little overdue, but it's really encouraging to see the shift in kind of focus in not just in the crypto industry, but, by and large, investors starting to look more at green tech.
And do you think that's a bit of a trend of people who had been in their teens now coming into their 20s and their 30s and carrying this forward? Is that part of the trend that you're seeing?
Yeah, definitely, right? I mean, younger demographics, as I said, tend to be more climate focused because they have a bigger stake in the game, right? They're the ones that have to live with the future that we leave to them. So I think as those younger investors, come of age and start to have a little bit more capital and start to be, more in control of where they deploy that capital, I think we're really going to start to see, kind of a hockey stick growth in these types of innovations. Match that with, as we said, this technology piece, this revolution in, distributed technology. I think it's the perfect catalyst for, a major paradigm shift in the way that we look at climate science.
Thank you, Mike. Stay right where you are while I bring everybody else up. And we're going to, if you don't mind, turn to some of the questions that are in the Q&A that have been here kind of in the past little while. So relative to things, we have one which is, hi, I'm a librarian at U of T. Our students are often wondering where to get started on learning about these particular topics. What would you say are your go-to resources to recommend to students to get the foundational learning required? And thanks for the discussion so far is what's been added to the comment. So what do you think? What are some of the go-to resources for that?
Maybe I can share a couple shameless personal plugs here.
Go for it.
So Crypto Weekly is essentially a news platform for everything, everything that's going on in the crypto space. And, what we try and do is offer a non-biased approach to just educating investors, consumers, retail, on what's going on in the space. And so we have a blog, we have a newsletter that goes out Monday mornings. We have a podcast, a website at cryptoweekly.co. We try and just share some non-biased information. The other resource, also a shameless plug, is I started a course in 2020 called Bitcoin 101, and it's not necessarily directly correlated to the climate science around Bitcoin, but it's a great introductory course for understanding Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and kind of their role in the world. And so if you're very new to the space, I always tell people kind of get started with Bitcoin because it's the mother of all cryptocurrencies and kind of what introduced the world to blockchain technology. And really, from there, you can go down the rabbit hole and learn about, all the Hedera hash graph and some of the other great layer one projects that are building. You can find that on Udemy. It's called Bitcoin 101.
Oh, nice. Thanks. Krasina, you look like you have something on the tip of your tongue there.
Yeah, I do. My approach is really scattered. So do not follow my approach, or I don't know, it's not a solution that works for everyone, but I am constantly plugged into Twitter. I do listen to a lot of podcasts. Bankless is my go-to podcast. I love those guys and what they do over there. Nowadays you have so much information online, and again, that's why I'm saying I do not recommend it for everyone, because it's really hard to actually find the quality information that could actually help you. I could definitely say that Crypto Weekly is a good source to go to. I've looked at it, and definitely some good content there. So well done, Mike, on that. Also, to be fair, most of the exchanges as well have their own newsletters, which sometimes provide with very useful information. So yeah, don't follow my approach, or do very scattered one.
If I could add, I think another great, I love Bankless, but another great podcast is The Breakdown. It kind of just talks about big picture power shifts around the world. So it's more of a macro podcast, but definitely a great starting point as well.
Oh, nice. Moving to the next question. How are these socially conscious tokens, like RECs, protected from pump and dump schemes?
Happy to hop in here, just speak a little bit about that. So there's a couple different types of tokens you may want to think about in the sense of, well, today we talked about carbon offsets, renewable energy credits, or carbon emissions tokens. In that sense, oftentimes today those are used to satisfy a business goal. And so part of that, you're not subject. It could in some degree. You're not subject as much to the fluctuations of the general crypto market, because they're different styles of tokens, oftentimes tied back to assets that are being traded that aren't on a DLT. So there's some type of generally known valuation for a type of credit. Oftentimes though, from a DLT perspective, because we have better auditability in certain types of credits, and you have to do your own research in terms of what's a good credit versus maybe a credit without any auditability, they're more valuable because we have that data tied to them. And I think with DOVU is a fantastic example. I think the farmers started selling at roughly maybe $20 a credit, and it got all the way up to 35 because the market saw the value of that auditability. Now, that's very different than, say, a fungible token or a coin of a native network like HBAR or the DOVU token or Bitcoin, which oftentimes are relatively well-known tokens, which have a little more stability than, say, an upstart fungible token, which is used for another layer one network. And I think there's there's a very popular phrase called "do your own research," which is the nicest way to say you have to do a lot of reading and due diligence yourself to understand what value that coin brings to the table, what value that token brings to the table, and how does it fulfill that purpose. Because a carbon offset is oftentimes used to satisfy how you are offsetting a carbon emission. That fungible token for Hedera, the HBAR, which is a native coin to our network, helps give security to our network and is used as a tool to pay for fees, to pay for transactions on the network. There's a lot of other coins out there that have different purposes. And so when you're doing that research, understanding from the project's perspective, third parties' perspective, how it's being used, and then watching the actual on-network transactions and learning how to do that, and emphasis on learning how to better understand yourself is the most important thing. And in Bitcoin context, we hear a lot of folks say, run your own node. Understand how to look at the information yourself is really an important concept, because this entire movement, the Web3 movement, is about self-empowerment to a large degree, and being able to understand that information is important.
Maybe I can add something kind of just from an investor point of view, and I can't speak directly to Rex, but crypto economies work in the same way as traditional or real world economies. It's all about supply and demand. And we have the ability with cryptocurrency tokens to build tokenomic designs, right? And so from an investor perspective, what we look for, especially in this design of the distribution of tokens and kind of the waterfall of liquidity that comes post launch, is trying to make sure there's not going to be a flood of liquidity at right at launch, or in certain intervals right after launch. When you invest in a seed round or a private round, your tokens get distributed over time. So 1 year, 2 year, 3 year vesting periods. It's a red flag if a project has a team token, the teammates or the team members, their tokens unlock right away, and so that's a lot of sell pressure that might be added to the market, right? So you want to make sure that when you're looking at tokenomic designs, they don't unlock all at one time. They have these kind of staggered unlocks, or even linear unlock is probably the best. Long-term vesting schedules for team and advisors, because that helps to build credibility for the project that they're going to be in it for the long term and not just looking to dump on retail investors as soon as the token launches. And also looking for real world utility of that token, right? You want to make sure that the token is not just an afterthought to the business, that there's actually a flow of value between users of the platform that is directly correlated to that token. So those are a few things that we look at in terms of like the tokenomic design. You also want to make sure that no kind of one individual player has access to too much of the market cap of the token, because that's a really big risk that they might dump on you at any time, and very hard to predict. So there's a lot that goes into that kind of decision-making process with regards to tokenomics. But the interesting thing is that that supply demand, or I guess the supply side, is really all in our hands now, with the ability of us as creators to build our own tokenomics and build our own economies.
It's really interesting, actually, Mike, because when you speak about supply and demand, absolutely in agreement with you, but looking at it from a different point of view and looking at it before even the supply and demand, you need to have a product, you need to have a business, you need to have the foundation that is built out there, and then you can talk. Well, no, actually, we've seen it in the market that sometimes you don't need that, and you still have the supply and the demand, which is the pump and dump that was asking the question. But having that foundation is, for us at least, the most important piece within the bigger picture and the puzzle.
Absolutely. And I would say you're dead on. I think we've had almost a black eye in the industry of with the 2017 history of the ICO boom, and it's actually relatively easy to spin up your own token, right? And you put a white paper together and you can sell a dream pretty easily in this space. But really what you want to see as an investor is an MVP, or a product that's been built already, and the token, in my opinion, should come later. Should come after that. But yeah, you're dead on, right? It's there's whenever there's an industry that's brand new and there's a lot of money to be made, it attracts bad actors, right? And so the age-old saying, do your own research, hits a lot harder in this industry, because if you don't, you could definitely get burned.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with you on that one.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And it's at this point that I want to thank everyone for being here. My first thank you, of course, is to everyone who's in attendance, everyone who came to listen to really incredible thoughts and sharing today on a most fascinating and important topic. So thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to these phenomenal researchers and entrepreneurs and what's happening in terms of this particular space. I want to thank as well the EaRTH district staff who have been behind. They've been adding things in terms of on the chat and on terms of making sure everything's set up, and they did an awful lot of work getting this pulled together, organized, and the rest. So in terms of that specifically, a huge thank out to both Kate Withers-Hess from University of Toronto Scarborough, Christine Morel from Centennial College. And in terms of things, yes, thank you everyone for being here. We do have a survey. So don't everybody just pile off and leave just yet. We do have a survey that we'd like you to fill out. You can find that by, well, just going to the QR code right on screen, and that'll bring you. Or in chat, I believe there's a link that's directly there in terms of this. Christine has just placed that in chat again as well. Lastly, for those of you who couldn't be with us today, couldn't join us for whatever reason, we look forward to you being able to share a link and being able to view some of this online as a recording that's going to be posted and shared out to the world. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here, and recording goes off.